So the name of this series is Through the Eyes of a Forest Manager, and the name of this event. And so what we're going to talk about is how forests work, and sort of how, a way to sort of look at them and really understand what they're about, and then how we translate them into taking care of them and when management is appropriate. Foresters are these people who, very frequently, especially foresters like me, we love forests intensely and intrinsically, and we also believe in the power of people to influence them positively and to be good forest stewards, and to have that not be entirely passive, to be able to do things in the world that helps them be healthier, that is regenerative and positive for them. And we're going to talk about what that looks like. I'm admitting my friend Brad to the event, and Brad made me promise that I was going to mention the Gloacus in this presentation. So if I don't do that, remind me to do that later. So I think about, we have all these weird ideas about what forests are and how they work, and most of them are wrong. One thing I've realized is that to develop a real understanding of how forests work, it's not something that any one of us, that is intuitive to any one of us. It's not something we're born with. It's something that we need to develop. And I think about this process of redeveloping that understanding as reimagining forests. What are forests really, and how do they work? So in almost every presentation I do, for the people who are on this from Vermont, they've seen this slide a gajillion times. What's a forest? So if you look up a definition of a forest, that definition will focus on trees, right? We all know when we're in a forest because there's like trees everywhere. And so we're like, all right, if it's got trees, it's a forest. When in reality, a forest is closer to this. So this is a definition from the book Wetland, Woodland, Wildland, by Liz Thompson, Eric Sorensen, which is this sort of compendium of natural communities in Vermont. And so they talk about a natural community as an interacting assemblage of organisms, their physical environment, and the natural processes that affect them. So when I think about a forest, I think of the trees as like the coral in a coral reef. So they are this living structure around which is built this whole world, this mass of life of startling complexity. So if we were thinking about a reef of coral, we wouldn't be like, oh yeah, it's a bunch of coral and nothing else, right? We would think about this whole web that is woven around that. To me, that's all of that. So the trees, the plants, the fungi, the wildlife, that's what the forest is. All the different pieces and parts. And so we're not doing a good job of managing the forest unless we're managing for that whole thing. So, what that means is we will talk about throughout the course of this presentation. And the other thing that's important to recognize that's inherent in this definition as well is that forests are not a static condition. They are a community. They're engaged in a dynamic process. And actually those processes, even the way that they change, is really, really important to how they work. They're complex, they're imperfect, they're messy, all the things that make us really uncomfortable, right? That's just how they are. And everybody thinks that a healthy forest looks like this, because this is what makes us feel really, really good. So we think about, when we idealize this like really beautiful, nice looking forest, we think about big trees and they're evenly spaced and the understory is completely clear. And if you go into a forest like that, you're like, wow, this looks really, really, really nice. And there are a couple forest types that do that naturally, like hemlock forest. One of the coolest things about a hemlock forest is, that lack of the understory because it's so shaded. And it's this really neat little environment. But for the most part, healthy forests look more like this. So healthy forests, again, are, they look messy to us. So if you look at what an old forest is, sort of these remnant old forests, or what we call old growth forests that we have in our region, what we see is that they are not neat and tidy. They are not easy for us to appreciate intuitively. They have big trees, but they also have trees of all different shapes and sizes and species and ages. They have dead wood on the ground. They have dead standing trees. They have a patchy, irregular canopy. It's like really crazy looking. And that's when we talk about sort of needing to develop an understanding of what healthy forests actually look like, because any of us, we see a forest like that and we think it needs to be cleaned up, when actually exactly the opposite is the case. A lot of the management that I do, which is this thing called, that we'll talk about later, called ecological forest management, is based on, we want to manage forests how they manage themselves. We want to manage them like, within the parameters of these natural processes, because we recognize that within these processes, and even the parts that are really hard for us to understand, like trees dying, right, and stuff that looks really messy to us, within those processes are nested habitats for that, all of those organisms that are part of the forest. And they're important not just because they're part of the forest, but they're important because they make the forest work. Things like fungi and microorganisms and bugs and rodents. The more we learn about forests, the more we understand how all these pieces and parts are not just important for their own sake, which I would argue that they also are, but they're important because they make this system work. And if we ignore them, it doesn't work. When I manage forests, I often manage for, or I talk about managing for diversity and for complexity. So diversity, we all know what that is, right? It's like a lot of different stuff in the same place. In a forest, you can have different types of diversity. If we're just talking about trees, you can have species diversity, a lot of different species of trees. And you can also have structural diversity. So structural diversity is, you can think about if species diversity is what is growing, the species that are there, structural diversity is the way that they're growing. So in addition to wanting a lot of different species of trees in our forest, we also want trees growing in lots of different ways. We want different shapes and sizes and ages of trees. We want patches of young trees, patches of old trees, patches of all those different things mixed together, because that's how forests work. And also because each one of those types of forest and each one of those species carries with it associations, relationships, and habitats for a wide range of different species. Diversity is also, as we study diversity and complexity. So complexity is just sort of all these different kinds of diversity layered on top of each other, creating a forest, which is, it's more than diverse. It's diverse on many levels. It's complex. Forests develop complexity and diversity naturally over time. It's just what they do. It's how they sort of invest in themselves. They don't become just big monster trees. They become complex. And complex and diverse forests are more resilient to climate change, more adaptable, and support a wider range of different wildlife species. So it's generally something that we want to encourage for a whole bunch of different reasons, especially as we sort of head into an uncertain future. More and more, as you understand how forests work, and you understand that forests are dynamic, that they have to change, that with change, and by change, I often mean like the mortality of trees dying, through change, actually comes a lot of these really beautiful things that make forests forests. And it's not just that they have to change, it's that they will change. And if you try and prevent them from changing, you're going to be very disappointed, because they're going to do it. They take a really long time. Everything's on a completely different time scale, of course, but it's going to happen. And so we need to shift our focus from trying to manage forests that are stable, that resist change, to forests that are resilient, that are capable of maintaining their health and their natural processes as they change. And we know that even more change is coming, right? Again, we're heading into an uncertain future. And so we need to recognize that this is going to be a very stressful and intense time for our ecosystems. And so we need to manage them to have the tools to be resilient. And a lot of that is through maintaining diversity. We also need to manage forests which are adaptive. So resilience and adaptive are sort of two words that we talk about a lot in managing forests for climate change now. So adaptive forests, similarly, are diverse. They are forests which are going to be able to shift and change and move with the environmental changes that are coming down the pike. And so we just know that, we can look at these old growth forests, we can look at the forests of, 300 years ago when Connecticut was almost completely forested, Vermont was almost completely forested, and use that as a reference condition. But we also have to acknowledge that the future that we're headed for is going to be different. It just is. And, as we face the problems of today, from the loss of native tree species or changes in the way that they behave, stuff like beech with beech bark disease, elm, Dutch elm disease, ash with the emerald ash borer, butternut with butternut canker, chestnut with the chestnut blight, all these invasive exotic plants, pests and pathogens, deer overpopulation, and more. We just need to acknowledge that we're off the map. We're heading into an uncertain future, and we need to give our forests the tools to change. So in forest management, this idea of legacy is a really powerful term. It means a few different things. So we think about legacy as biological legacies. So, managing forests that have these big old trees, that's a biological legacy, a legacy of a past generation, which carries with it all of these cool and really important benefits. But we also, as forest managers, operating and taking care of these ecosystems, which really are expansive over time, we get to think about what legacy we want to leave for future generations. What world are we building for our children and our children's children? We have the power to really take care of these systems and to make them healthy and abundant, and to give future generations the ability to have clean air and clean water, live in places that are beautiful, be able to see the wildlife that we see, and all of these other, live in a climate that is tolerable. All of these things are benefits that come from ecosystems, and we have tremendous power over them, both to destroy them and to really, really help them become something better, become healthy, to help them heal. And we also, the other thing about legacy is that it can be very frustrating because we inherit all of these really intense legacies from the past that we had nothing to do with it, just like in our communities, right? We get what we get. We don't get to choose the legacies we inherit. The choice that we have is what we're going to do about it. So New England in the early 1800s into the early 1900s, and this is true for Vermont as it is for Connecticut, went through a period of rapid human-caused environmental change. So throughout New England, about 80% of our forests were deforested. Most of New England was forested prior to European colonization. And by the 1820s to the 1850s, it was about 20% forested. So what that means is that basically every forest you've ever been in was a field 200 years ago. And many of them were maintained as fields for centuries. We saw by the 1850s, that peak of 80% deforestation started to decline. But really, a lot of those pastures remained open until the early to mid 1900s. And we know that most of our forests in New England are incredibly young, like 60 to 100 years old. They haven't had time to really develop into what we call old growth forests, to develop that complexity that comes from multiple generations of forests on an area. Remarkable effects on wildlife, obviously from habitat loss, right? Moving from an area that's pretty darn close to 100% forested to 20% forested. We lost a lot of habitat. And we also did things like, kill species on purpose. So this is a picture of the last catamount shot in Vermont, the eastern cougar, AKA the eastern puma. They had those in Connecticut too, and wolves. And, oh, I'm gonna admit somebody. And, we put bounties on those and hunted them to extinction in addition to habitat loss. Some of our fur bearers, like beavers, were extirpated from New England, mainly from trapping for furs. So we have this dramatic influence, not just on the trees, right, but on those wildlife species, which are also part of forests. We think about these guys, if I can change this slide. These guys, beavers, So this is a picture from a 1921 reintroduction of beavers in Vermont. I believe they were reintroduced in Connecticut as well in the early mid 1900s. You know, these are the classic example of an organism that has a tremendous effect on its environment. In Vermont, we think that prior to European colonization, and I think that Connecticut was probably very similar, we had as many as 300 beaver dams per square mile in our valley habitats. So a square mile is 640 acres. So that's a beaver dam every 2 acres. And we know that by the late 1600s, that 250,000 of them had been shipped out of just a very small part of Vermont and sent to Europe. And so the result of that was not just the loss of this organism, but the loss of this incredible habitat that it provides. You know, and we have many other examples of, you know, losing an organism and losing, you know, a species of wildlife, and having everything go all out of whack. You know, and now we're experiencing that less so in Vermont than I think in Connecticut with deer overpopulation, right? That this is a native organism that has lost its historic predators and is exposed to new environmental conditions and an increasingly fragmented and developed landscape and lower human predation. And as a result, you know, they're just totally decimating our ecosystems. Other examples in Vermont, and I know that the fisher was reintroduced in Connecticut as well, I think in the late 80s. In Vermont, the fisher is the historic predator of the porcupine. And there was a porcupine bounty in Vermont for like 50 years, where you would, you know, kill a porcupine and cut the ears off and bring it into the town clerk. And they had to do it because the porcupines were just like eating people's houses. So there's all these weird effects that come from losing species from our landscapes, not the least of which, right, is the effect on the ecosystems themselves and the loss of these subtle and really important relationships that make forests work. We also had the influence of historic forest management and logging. So it wasn't just agriculture, it was also exploitations of forests. There was this, in the early 1900s, we started thinking about managing forests a little bit harder. So this largely German at that time idea of, you know, that we should be managing forests thoughtfully, which is a good idea, but they also thought that we should manage them with this idea of the regulated forest being that we should control every single aspect of them to produce timber as efficiently as possible. Planted a lot of conifer plantations. I'm sure you got them down there: red pine, white pine, Norway spruce, Scots pine, Japanese larch. You know, all these trees growing in these perfect straight rows, which are a good way to grow timber quickly sometimes, but are a terrible way to grow forests, right? Because they're just the trees and nothing else, and they don't have any of those other qualities that we associate with healthy forests. There's also this idea of decadent versus thrifty trees. So decadent trees were big old trees that were just taking up space. You know, they weren't growing a valuable product anymore. And we were supposed to kill those or just get them out of the way to make room for smaller, faster growing trees that we called thrifty. And so people cut down these big old trees that we now know have this incredible value to wildlife and to forest ecology, just to get them out of the way. They weren't worth anything. They just wanted to get them out of the way to grow smaller, healthier trees. We also saw just general short-sighted management, high grading, which is where you cut all the healthy trees and leave the unhealthy trees because the healthy trees are the most valuable. Diameter limit cutting, where you just cut the big trees and you leave the little trees. Same problem. You're just basically doing the reverse of what we want to do, managing for a less healthy forest with less healthy trees, and doing a really bad job protecting soils. You know, not complying with anything like the BMPs that we have today that hopefully safeguard our soils and don't allow, you know, just big ruts up and down the mountain that are going to cause erosion and sedimentation and all these other things. And are ultimately, if we're losing soils, right, we're losing fertility in that forest. And so the legacy of the clearing of the 1700s, 1800s into the 1900s is that our forests are not like the forests that were here prior to that. Our forests are young. They lack big trees. They lack diversity, complexity, some of these other attributes that old forests have, like dead wood, soil carbon. And across our landscapes, we also lack diversity. So diversity is something we want to cultivate not just within a forest, but also across the landscape so that we have different types of habitats and different stages of development, and we just don't really have that right now. We have different tree species than we did at that time. So in Vermont, a big example of this is American beech. So we know that American beech was like 60%, 40 to 60, depending on where you were in Vermont, 40 to 60% of all the trees were American beech, followed by eastern hemlock. And now those are relatively minor tree species in our landscape, both because of that, the fact that they all got cut down, and beech takes a long time to grow. It's shade tolerant. And so it doesn't tend to be able to just shoot right up out of an old field. And also because of beech bark disease, which is an invasive, non-native invasive pest and pathogen that attack beech trees. And so we have different tree species all of a sudden. And we also have different wildlife species dynamics as a legacy of losing some of those species and having different populations and having these species sort of react to the way that our landscape has changed. So when we think about climate change, it's easy to be a little bit myopic or sort of tunnel visioned about carbon, which is really, really important. And it's really important because forests sequester and store a lot of carbon globally. And it's really, really important that we keep our forests healthy and that we keep them as forests so they can continue to do that. But it's also really important that we recognize that what we're facing is not purely climate change. We are facing what we call global change, which is climate change plus all the other stuff, all the other ways that we've influenced our ecosystems. So we've changed natural disturbance regimes, we've introduced invasive exotic plants, pests, pathogens, animals. We've converted forest land to other land use types, lost it, fragmented it with roads and buildings into smaller and smaller pieces. Pollution is a huge influence. So all of these things are really contributing to sort of the mass of what our ecosystems are dealing with right now. So it's climate change, but it's also all this other stuff. And in addition to being in a climate crisis, we're in a biodiversity crisis, right? So we're in the middle of this mass extinction event, the sixth of which we know of, and there's history. And in a time period that many now call the Anthropocene. So this is a geologic era in which humans are the dominant influence on our climate and on our ecology. We're in the middle of this massive constriction of biodiversity globally. Global animal populations are greater than 50%. Actually, this should say over 60% of what they were in 1970. So that means not that we have 50% of the number of species, but that there are literally 60%, over 60% less animals on the planet than there were 50 years ago. And they're going extinct at a rate that far exceeds what happens naturally, because extinction is a natural process, but not like this. In the background, you see one of our extinct species that used to roam the forests of Connecticut and Vermont, the eastern elk. It's a forest-dwelling elk that lived here, extirpated in the late 1700s. So, you know, it's pretty bleak, but it is important that we recognize that right now, in this moment, you know, about 1 million animal and plant species are threatened with extinction, which in, you know, more than 40% of amphibians, a third of reef-forming corals, a third of marine mammals are threatened. We've lost almost 700 vertebrate species since the 16th century. Invertebrates, so essentially bugs, which make up about 90%, 97% of our biodiversity, and most of which we don't even know about yet. We've lost conservatively 100,000 species. And globally, you know, this isn't just a New England problem, this is a global problem. And so globally, we have rapid global forest cover loss of biodiversity. The US is a big reason for that. A lot of these forests are being lost to in some way provide a resource, often an agricultural resource. And the US is less than 5% of global population, but we consume about a third of its resources. So we're consuming more than our fair share, and it's increasing. And we know that these effects, climate change, resource extraction and consumption, processing, disproportionately affect poorer and more vulnerable communities, both in the US and across the globe. So we just got to recognize, and this is one of the things where sometimes we get so bummed, you know, about all this stuff, and we're like, you know, there's no way that humans could do anything good. We can't. But we just need to recognize that we live in this highly altered landscape, and there is no one else that can do anything. There's no one who's coming to save us. There is no one else who can do something about all of these things besides us. And so I often bring up this idea of responsibility. So there's this awesome book. Mike mentioned Sand County Almanac. There's another really great book about land ethic that's a little bit newer by Robin Wall Kimmerer. That's called Braiding Sweetgrass. And in that, the author talks about the fact that when we buy land, right, we purchase this bundle of rights. Here are all the rights that we have, right? These are all the things we're allowed to do on our land, and we hold those rights very tightly and are very reticent to restrict other people's rights. But we never talk about having responsibilities. That when we buy a land, we also purchase a bundle of responsibilities. So what do we owe to that land? What do we owe to each other? What is our responsibility to try to fix things, even if we didn't cause them, right? That legacy that we inherited. And how do we move forward? So we mentioned this earlier, one of the reasons why, one of the responsibilities that we have to each other is that in both Connecticut and in Vermont, forests are foundational to our lives. They make our lives beautiful. They support our lives fundamentally. They make it physically possible for us to live here, and they also make our lives better, and they're beautiful. And most of those forests are owned by private individuals. So again, in Vermont, that's 80% of our forests. In Connecticut, that's over 70% owned by just people. And so we say that these are private forests that are producing public benefits. And so we have a responsibility, if you're the steward of a piece of land, whether it's land that you own or just public land in a town that you live in, you have a responsibility not just to yourself or to that land, but also to your community, to the other people who are benefiting from that land, even if they don't realize it. And so then it becomes like, okay, so we got to do some stuff about the situation that we're in. So how do we do that? How do we develop a relationship with our forests and our other ecosystems that is positive, holistically positive? It's a complicated question. Some of it is reframing our ideology, thinking about what are the way, going back to sort of the beginning of the presentation, reimagining what a forest is and how it works, and then thinking about where we're at, with how our forests, both locally and globally, and thinking about how we can be a force for good in all of that context. So this is a quote from Elizabeth Kolbert. This is another really, really good book. The Sixth Extinction. Elizabeth Kolbert won a Pulitzer Prize for this book. She says that, quote, having freed ourselves from the constraints of evolution, humans nevertheless remain dependent on the Earth's biological and geochemical systems. So we feel like, we're more and more distant from our ecosystems, but we're still completely dependent upon them for literally everything that we use, everything that we have, and our physical bodies, our ability to be alive. And it's important that we remember that. And as we develop this sort of more evolved understanding, we need to remind ourselves that everything that we do has an impact on ecosystems somewhere, somehow. The question is not if we want to have an impact on them. The question is, what do we want that impact to be? It's really, really, I do a lot of work with forests, with forest management. And again, I believe in forest management. I believe it can be done in a way that is really, really positive, that is regenerative, that is beautiful, and that supports all of these other things we care about. It's not solely extractive. But when we're cutting trees and we're pulling them out of the woods and we're creating a local renewable resource, that makes people really uncomfortable, and it changes the way the forest looks, even though forests are supposed to change, right? And it makes the forest look messy, even though forests are supposed to look messy. It makes everybody really uncomfortable, but at the same time, it's a local renewable resource that's being produced from a living system, and we think we can do it while making that system healthier. And so, you know, all these people who are up in arms about it are also consuming resources that are just produced somewhere else. You know, they're probably a non-renewable resource. Everything they're wearing, you know, all the energy they're consuming is probably a non-renewable resource that is impacting peoples and ecosystems across the world. And so I think it's really sort of this profound thing to think about. Okay, it's not that we have a choice whether we want to have an impact or not. We're going to have an impact. And so let's really own that impact and think about what do we want that to be proactively, progressively. Mm-hmm. Mike mentioned this idea of the land ethic, coined by Aldo Leopold. It's amazing. It's such a contemporary idea, but you know, Aldo Leopold wrote about it like in the 40s. And it's this idea that as we think about our community, as we think about the entities that we ascribe to, you know, that we think of as being worthy of our ethical consideration, that we don't just consider people, but that we also consider these biological systems that are fundamental to our survival. That we are not just a conqueror of the land, but we're a member of a community with the land. And we need to form a relationship with it where it's actually functional so that we can survive. And so that we can not just survive, but also, you know, survive in abundance and prosper and live good lives and live beautiful lives, all these other things that forests make possible. I run into this, these two sort of like opposing mentality when I talk about this stuff, and when I think about this stuff, and just when I walk in the woods with landowners, I run into these two opposing mentalities. I call them takers versus leavers. So takers are people who believe that the only purpose of our ecosystems is to provide for us, right? They exist to serve. They are for us, and anything we do to them is totally fine, right? Because they belong to us and they're for us. Those people are terrible forest managers. They do an awful job because they totally misunderstand what forests are and misunderstand the ways in which managing them with that sort of like short-sighted and selfish mentality really degrades them in the long term. It makes sense for, you know, you can do that kind of thing and not realize it, that it's bad, but over any period of time, it's completely unsustainable. But the opposing force to that is leavers. So leavers are people who sort of go the other way, right? They believe that anything we do to forests is wrong, that we cannot possibly interfere with them in any way. And so the interesting thing about this is that both of these stances are problematic in their own way. So both of them fail to see themselves as part of ecosystems. Both of them fail to have a real relationship with ecosystems. Takers disregard the idea that our actions can damage forests, that forests and their, you know, that forest, that whole web of life that's a forest, right? That parts of that might have intrinsic value, that you might have some responsibility to them, that your actions might damage or interfere with the ability of future generations to have those same benefits that you have. And leavers, you know, like stick their head in the sand and disregard the possibility that we could ever do anything positive for forests. They're uncreative. And so they don't do anything about it, as everything, you know, as all these different things that we're talking about, the fact that our forests are profoundly altered and that they have all of these crazy things affecting with them. And here we are, the only organisms on Earth that have the power to actually help them. And they're like, no, you know, we just shouldn't interfere with them at all. There are great things about people who think about both forests in both of those ways. You know, takers are really pragmatic. They love doing stuff, and leavers love forests, and that's good. But we really need to think about the balance. So we are, right, we're these biological organisms. We're connected to ecosystems irrevocably and are completely reliant on them. And we need to acknowledge that we have power like no other creature on Earth, and ask ourselves, how do we use that power, not to degrade ecosystems and continue to exploit them, but to enrich them, to make them healthier, to make them more complex. And so in addition to reimagining forests, some of us have been thinking about how to also reimagine forest management. Thinking about, can forest management have, the cutting of trees, logging, have a positive influence on forests? And can forests and forest management have a positive influence on our world? And I think that the answer is yes. So there's this radical idea of it's not radical, it's an old idea, but radical in the fact that we're actually out there doing it. This radical idea of ecological forestry, also called ecological silviculture, ecological forest management. The idea that we would manage forests, again, like they manage themselves, right? So recognizing that this system has value, that we manage forests as complex systems, that when we manage forests, we have that reimagined understanding of what forests are. So we're recognizing the importance of all the organisms and the processes that make forests work. And often we're managing young forests, which haven't yet had the chance to have that diversity and complexity with which comes all these cool other attributes, managing young forests to be more like old growth forests. And what that looks like is, creating essentially natural disturbances. So we're out there cutting trees and pushing forests into what we hope is a more resilient, adaptive, diverse, complex condition. We're managing not for a plantation, but for many different ages, sizes, and species of trees, for tons of dead wood on the ground. We're retaining and even recruiting big old legacy trees, just big old trees whose sole job is to just live in the forest forever and just eventually to become big old dead trees. Creating small pockets of early successional habitat, young forest habitat, and other unique habitats that are underrepresented across our landscape, and protecting sensitive and unusual features. We're basically making a big mess and trying to do so in a way that is both extracting a local renewable resource and is creating conditions where our forests can be more diverse and more complex and more resilient in the future. And we're doing that by studying the way that forests naturally grow and develop and emulating that in the way that we cut trees. And then we also need to zoom out and to think about managing for ecologically functional, diverse landscapes. So again, we're going to manage young, simple forests that are not complex to be more resilient and diverse and complex. We're trying to protect large forested blocks from fragmentation. Conservation is the best way to do that, permanently protecting land forever, but not also, creating rules in your communities that restrict forest fragmentation, the ability to go into these forest blocks and to fragment them with roads and houses and other types of development. That's really, really important. We're also creating pockets of habitat that are underrepresented across our landscape. We're also allowing forests to be unmanaged. So when you have the taker and the lever mentality, you have like the takers, which is often sort of the more old school forestry industry. They're like, man, to not manage an area of forest is a fundamental sort of existential threat to our lives. And every acre of forest should be managed. And then the levers would be like, no acre of forest should ever be managed, and to do so in any way is bad. And in reality, for a lot of us, we think that managing forests in a really, really good way and leaving some areas of forests unmanaged are two strategies that are complementary. And it's not just that they don't get in each other's way; it's that they really, really make each other even better. We know that even if we're doing the best forest management in the world for all this ecological stuff, and it has so much value, that it's not going to be exactly the same as a forest, which is just completely left to its own devices. And so when we want to cultivate diversity across our landscape, we also want that. And addressing landscape level threats. So by that, I mean this big stuff like non-native invasive plants, deer overpopulations, forest loss, fragmentation, stuff like that. So addressing these biodiversity threats, again, like invasive plants, deer, development, a lot of this stuff requires making these really, really tough decisions. Like, I feel like, for the people here who have seen me speak before, I'm always sort of chagrined by the fact that I'm constantly telling people to do stuff they don't want to do. I'm telling them to cut trees, cut beautiful trees. I'm telling them to kill beautiful deer. I'm telling them to use herbicide to control invasive plants. All of these things are like just some of the really tough decisions that are necessary in order to protect all of the things we care about in these beautiful ecosystems. Non-native invasive plants with herbicide, it's like, you tell these people who love ecosystems and who fundamentally hate herbicide that we want to use herbicide as a restoration tool, and it just blows their minds. But at the same time, it's like, what is really progressive in that context is not just saying, nope, I'm never going to use herbicide. This is just something that's not part of our world. What's the really progressive mentality is embracing the nuance of being like, wow, this is a tool that can also be used. I think about it as being used in like a little bit of a subversive way that was created to suppress biodiversity, but that can also be used to enhance biodiversity. And it's the only way to kill these plants on any scale. And so it's what we do. And we don't think it's not a big deal, in the same way that, I cut trees and I kill deer, and I never feel like it's not a big deal. It always feels like a big deal, but it's part of this broader picture of how we build a healthier landscape. And local renewable resources, I mean, like with cutting wood, this is another one of these things. I don't like cutting trees, but again, I think it can be done in a way that's really, really positive. Localism is probably the most powerful thing that we can do to protect ecosystems and to protect organisms globally, because most of our impact on ecosystems is way far away and is in the form of resource extraction. So it's really important that we know where our resources come from, that we understand that resource production is messy and it's going to make us uncomfortable, and it's a big deal. To try and keep the good parts of our resource production at home and avoid outsourcing those uncomfortable parts. So like if you're consuming a resource and the effects of that resource are not something that you'd be comfortable having in your community, you probably shouldn't be sending it to someone else's community or to someone else's ecosystem. So bringing that stuff home, even if it makes us uncomfortable, is really powerful. And I just a plug for forest management, again, just as a person who loves forests and ecosystems intrinsically. I believe in forest management. I believe it can be profoundly positive. And, to do it, we sort of have to reject this not in my backyard mentality. We know that that is a force that contributes not just to outsourcing our resources, all those impacts to peoples and to ecosystems somewhere else, but also to environmental injustice, what we call it, now we recognize as environmental racism, because we know that those impacts are disproportionately outsourced to communities of color and to impoverished communities. Taking charge over those environmental and social impacts of our resources, taking charge of the resources that we use. So saying, again, using local renewable resources instead of non-local, non-renewable resources. Forest management can also make it more affordable to own land. So you don't have to be a rich person to own land. Having this periodic output from your forest can also be help prevent people from needing to sell their land or make it so that only rich people can own land, so that we can all do it. And we think it, in that way, it lowers development pressure and protects forest and land. So I talk about, this a lot, that embracing the nuance, right? As we build this relationship with our ecosystems, it's radical and progressive idea to dive into murky waters between these sort of like simple truths, right? To recognize that we can love old growth forests and manage forests, that we can or in ways that harm forests, and that both of those things can be true in the same world. It's not about finding a midpoint between these polarities that are like seemingly everywhere in our world. It's about just recognizing that, like our forests, this stuff is complex, and it's supposed to be complex. And also to recognize that we're here too, right? So we want to build healthy local and global ecosystems, and we also want to build healthy, just, equitable, prosperous, safe, beautiful local and global communities. That's it. So with that big chunk of information for you all, I am going to stop sharing my screen, and I would love to take some questions. So if you got questions, pop them in the chat, and I would be happy to try and answer them if I can.
Well, we do have questions, and we'll start off with the first one. Looks like it's from Mary Algren. How old is an old growth forest, and where could we see one in Vermont or Connecticut?
That's a great question. So, and that's a very divisive question. So I write and talk about old growth forests extensively. So I, sort of, this might be a deeper dive than you really need, but there's a few different definitions. Some people would say that an old growth forest can only be an old growth forest if it's like an original forest, or what we call a primary forest. So it's never been disturbed by people, or extensively disturbed, or alternately by European descended people. So it could have been, managed and used by indigenous peoples, but not by European peoples. So with that mentality, we sort of have what we have, and you can't get any more. However, other people would say that an old growth forest is a forest which is, sort of old enough, and we could set a number on how old that is. A lot of people would say, in Vermont, would say 150 years. But for some of the characteristics that are endemic to old growth forests, especially like the dead wood, by the way, is this like profoundly, really, really important part of forest ecology. And you can imagine that if you have stock, sort of these stalks of dead wood that are building up in your forest for thousands of years, and then you manage it as a cow pasture for 150 years, that wood isn't there anymore. And it takes a while to get it again. One of the craziest statistics about dead wood is that one study found that there's 4 times as much living biomass in a dead tree as in a living tree. So what that is microorganisms, fungi, invertebrates, all these little critters, salamanders, rodents. It's this incredibly important thing. So anyway, so to develop the dead wood characteristics that we'd associate with an old growth forest takes longer, like 300 years, multiple generations of trees. But, and as still a third definition for what an old growth forest is that an old growth forest is what we'd call a late successional forest. So succession, as forests develop, they pass through these different stages. Each one succeeds the last, which is why we call the process of forest development succession. And late successional forests are those that have the qualities that we talked about. So they have some big trees, but lots of different sizes and ages of trees. They have lots of dead wood on the ground. They have this patchy, irregular canopy. And so you could have a forest like that that's not 150 years old. You could have a 150-year-old forest that's not like that. There's a forest in Vermont called the Cambridge Pines, where it's thought of as an old growth forest because it's over 150 years old. But what it really is a pasture from the early 1800s that was allowed to revert back to forest. Like a lot of these old pastures, it grew an even age stand of white pine, which are now absolutely massive and 150 feet tall. But they haven't, what it really is it's still that single generation of trees. They're old trees, but it doesn't have a lot of those sort of emergent attributes that we now would associate with old growth forests. Like, again, what's going to happen when those trees start dying? That's when that's going to become an old growth forest. So yeah, so that's a sort of a non-answer to your question, but just to say that it's really complicated, and there's a lot of misunderstandings about old forests. In Vermont, we probably have on the aggregate right now like 1,000 acres of old growth-ish forest scattered in these little patches all over the place. There's more coming down the line, like on state land, there's a bunch of unmanaged forest that it's not old growth forest yet, but in theory it will become old growth forest. In the Green Mountain National Forest, there's 100,000 acres of natural areas that are in theory again becoming old growth forest. It just takes centuries. There are, if you want to, so in Vermont, if you want to look it up, what you should look up is there was a story that was done on Vermont Public Radio about old growth forests. So if you search for Vermont Public Radio or VPR, old growth forests, an article will come up about it. And there's actually a list of areas of old growth forest in Vermont. I'm not sure if such a database exists in Connecticut or not.
Great. Thank you. Next one. Please give an example of improvement strategy that you could suggest after evaluating the health and diversity of a local forest.
Okay, so you know, it all depends on what's going on. So our forests have these, you know, we have this sort of general story across our landscape, right? Of like everything got cleared, maintained as pasture for some amount of time, and then was allowed to revert to forest. But within that, we have all these different ways that expresses itself. And that's because areas were allowed to revert from field to forest at different times. We have different sites. So when they did that, they did it sort of in different ways. And then we have areas that were, you know, since that time that were managed, that were logged, and all the different, you know, sort of repercussions of that. So, you know, I'll give you an example of a young stand. So a stand is just an area of trees. A young stand in the Miltontown Forest, which is a forest that I'm writing a forest management plan for right now. And it's a big stand, it's like 90 acres, and it's all sugar maple poles. So they're all sugar maple trees. They're all like this big. They're 60 years old. They're, you know, like probably 6 or 7 inches in diameter. And they're, you know, so they're healthy trees. There's nothing wrong with them really, except that, you know, it's this totally bizarre, weird forest. And the other thing that's going on there, so in Vermont, I believe this is true for Connecticut as well, we have no native earthworms. So, you know, all of our earthworms, most of them are European. We also have Asian ones. And everybody's like, whoa, we love earthworms, you know, because they're such a boon to agriculture, but they're actually a major ecological problem. And what they do is they digest, especially leaf litter, but just organic material in our forest too quickly. And then we don't have that really rich decomposing layer that we call the duff, which species like sugar maple need to establish in. So here we have this even-aged forest, doesn't have a lot of diversity in structure because they're all just trees of the same age, same size. Doesn't have a lot of species diversity. They're all sugar maple. And it has this massive earthworm problem. So there's just like no wood on the ground at all. And the result of that is that we have no new regeneration of sugar maple because they need that leaf litter. And there's nothing to stop water from just running down the surface of those slopes and just eroding those soils. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go into that stand and we're going to thin it. It'll be a pre-commercial thinning. We're just going to drop the trees and leave them on the ground. When we drop them and leave them on the ground, we are going to not cut them up at all. So this is what now when I deal with loggers are used to you telling them they got to cut up all the brush and make it look neat and tidy, and so it appeals to everybody's aesthetic sensibilities, but that has no ecological purpose, and actually it detracts from the ecological benefits of that dead wood retained in the wood, which has tremendous value. So we're going to cut up those trees. We're going to leave them all crazy and messy looking on the ground. We're not just going to, you know, lower the density in that stand, although lowering the density of trees in that stand will be beneficial because it'll allow those small trees to become big trees sooner. And big trees have all these ecological benefits that we want, you know. And we're also going to create little gaps. So we're going to create little holes in the canopy where new species can establish. And because there's going to be this big jumbled mess of trees, we hope that we'll be able to have less deer browse on those areas because the deer won't be able to physically reach their heads in. As those, you know, by putting dead wood on the ground, we'll be providing some dead wood, which is completely absent. So providing all of those ecological benefits of dead wood. And we hope that as it rots, it will help attenuate some of that erosion and provide this boost of organic material in the soil to deal with that worm issue. So that's sort of an example of, you know, we call it multi-solving, right? We're doing things that are trying to solve multiple problems all at once. And so what we're hoping that we're doing is we're solving all these acute problems. We're providing new habitats in this really simple, non-complex forest, making it more complex and diverse. We are solving, you know, dealing with this earthworm problem. We're dealing with deer browse. And then we're also just trying to create a forest which is in general more complex and more interesting and more diverse and hopefully more resilient and adaptive sooner than it would naturally occur. So, another example of that in a context with bigger trees is that we could do a very similar thing in a mature forest within the context of a commercial logging job. So you have a logger in there, you're cutting trees, they're worth money. If this is your land, maybe you're making some money, but we're trying to still, push that young forest, even if it doesn't seem like it's young, it probably is, push it into, be more like an old growth forest and leave these crazy jumbled tops everywhere, leave dead wood on the ground, leave dead standing trees, create gaps where we can get new regeneration, all those things. Usually, we're just trying to mess it up in the best possible way. And then, sort of when I do work on public lands, I had this moment where I was like, do I want to make this forest management look neater and tidier so that it will be less intimidating to people, or do I just want to do it the way we should do it and just explain why? And so that's the latter option is what I've chosen. We do it and it looks crazy to everybody, and then we talk about why that's a better reflection of what forests actually are supposed to look like than the alternative.
Next, we have a question and a possible answer, and we'll see. What is the minimum size of a forest and how small is too small? And then Brad goes on to say, it must relate to any forest connection to other forests. How fragmented are the connections to what ecology needs? Ethan probably has a better answer.
Yeah, I do, but the answer is that it's complicated. But the answer is that I think there's a few things that are nested in there. A very small area can be an area that we would call forests. It's just that where we see the forest patch size, the area of forest that is unfragmented by roads and by like houses and buildings, as that patch size increases, we see a greater diversity of organisms that are able to live there. So, in your backyard, quarter-acre woodlot, you can have squirrels and possums and raccoons and skunks. And as that patch gets a little bit bigger, you can add a few more species in there. And as it gets bigger, you can add a few more. And then as that patch gets really big, that's where you start to see like the full reflection of the diversity of different organisms that can exist there. We think that, and there's actually, I'm sure there's a similar thing in Connecticut, but we created in 2015 here in Vermont something that we called the Forest Fragmentation Report. You could search it up. That has a lot of good background information, not just about Vermont, but about forest fragmentation in general. And one thing that it says is that really to have any area that we would call interior forest, sort of these areas that are no longer affected by these edges of these fragmenting features like roads, we need to go in 300 feet from the nearest edge, right? So 300 feet, which is a very far distance. And if you start going around and looking at our forested blocks and mapping out a 300-foot buffer from each one of those, from a house, from a road, etc., you see that it really detracts from the amount of interior, or what we might call core habitat that we have. It needs to be much, much larger. So like on my forest, which is 175 acres, we have some interior habitat, but not a lot, because I'm right by the highway, and I have a major road that goes right by my place, and there's houses bordering my property. So that's sort of what that answer makes me think of. But as far as like how big is a forest, I don't know. You know it when you see it, I think.
We got a question, and I think the answer to the braiding sweetgrass book, so we won't go there. Question, as forests start to regrow in New England, do you think we are vulnerable to wildfires like out west? Actually seems wetter in Vermont lately.
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated, right? Like how it seems, how it's not necessarily a good reflection of how it is. It's sort of like in Vermont, like deer. So I know that in southern New England, deer is like only tool, and we can make a huge difference. But you have this thing where people are like, well, but I don't see very many deer. But so yeah, how it seems is not necessarily a good reflection. Also, because the way that climate change actually plays out is like so weird, and it's just so different. But anyway, yeah, if a forester from the Western United States came to one of my logging jobs, he would want to throw me in jail because I put as much dead wood on the ground as I possibly can. And out there, a lot of their deal is it's fire management. It's the attenuation of this one massive, threat vector into their forests. It's not something that we worry about now in Vermont. There might be systems in Connecticut that are more prone to burning, but in Vermont, it's not something that we're concerned about, but it could become that way. It could be that in 30 years, it's something that we're really worried about. We don't really know. At this moment, it's not something that is a huge concern. It's not something that we're managing forests in light of, really.
Next question. Can you suggest an approach to educating the public about the importance of forests to a town like Glastonbury?
Yeah, I mean, this is doing an event series like what we're talking about is a really good way to do it. I think that one thing I say, and I do, so I'm sort of like balancing two different things. I'm educating people about forests, which are I think are important in their own right, and also about forest management, which I think actually educating people about forest management, I think is actually a surprisingly, although it's really intimidating and divisive, it's surprisingly actually like a really good way to talk to people about forests, and to get people involved with that. What I say is that most people are in favor of forest management. They just don't know it yet. We just have all these things. It's like that idea in all of our heads about what that well-managed forest looks like, which is just completely the opposite of what a healthy forest actually looks like. We just have this idea that we know what we know about these things, and we don't. So I've had a lot of success so backing up, I had this forest management project at a town forest, public land, in Heinsberg, Vermont, where I really wanted to get people to come out. And I didn't want it to be that people just felt like they had the opportunity to come out and check it out and to ask questions about it. I wanted people to actually show up, but was having trouble doing it. You do a forest management walk and open to the public and free and everything, and you get 12 people, and then you do another one, you get another 12 people, and half of them are the same people as the first time. And then I did a walk, and I did a wildlife walk, and it was ostensibly the same walk, a lot of the same content, going to the same places, but we had a wildlife biologist, and we worked with our Fish and Wildlife department to publicize it, and we talked about wildlife more, and we got 40 people, and I was like, okay, so how else can we do this? And I started to think about it as almost tricking people. Like, we know that forests are so foundational to our lives in so many ways. And so it's our job, if you want to get people to even really think about it, you got to get them to show up in some way, not always even physically. Like, you just got to get them to be willing to think about it a little bit more. And I think that we have such a compelling argument for how important ecosystems are, that if we can get people to do that and give them just a little bit of the right information in that moment, that we will win them over, that we will change their behavior and the way that they think about it. And so in this process, I started, so number one, partnering with unusual organizations. So organizations that weren't used to being asked to talk about forest management, like Vermont Pride Center. They have this, series of walks that they call Pride Hikes. Audubon, Vermont, we did all these walks about forest birds and how forest management and bird habitat management can be integrated. Did a walk with this awesome forest scientist, Tony D'Amato from here in Vermont, and we talked, who does a lot of research on carbon and climate change and managing forests for climate adaptability. We just started framing each walk in a unique way and involving all these different partners. We did a walk with the local co-op. We did a walk with all these different people, and I think it just, when people see other partners, other different organizations that they trust, co-signing this thing that we're doing, even whether it's a forest or if it's forest management or whatever, or they see forest management attached to other things. Maybe they don't care about forest management, but here's something they do care about. It's me, they don't care about forest management, but they care about birds. And I'm out there with people from Audubon, and we're talking about how positive this forest management is for these bird species they care about. That to me has been profound. And the other thing is just that I've been doing is just trying to get people in I call it making the message unavoidable. So in these communities, just, it's not just about what you say, but it's also about how you reach out to people, and reaching out to people in like every possible way. So we were on getting on TV and getting on the radio and getting on, publicized through different partners, social media, and making these short informational videos that could easily be shared, writing articles, doing press releases, all this different stuff. And if we were doing that about something as unpopular as forest management, surely we can do it for just, how cool forests are or something like that. But for me, it's like, it's about getting people to show up. And then when they show up, you can at least expose them to some of the nuance. And I would even argue, last thought on this, I would even argue that if people show up, even if they're mad, it's better than them just sitting at home and just thinking whatever they think.
Mm. Next one, please talk about wildfire mitigation. You've already touched on it some, but you might want to add to it.
I don't really know anything about wildfire mitigation. It's not something we really do. And, I would defer, it's not something that we think about in this moment. And probably, again, like so much of what I do is probably totally antithetical to wildfire mitigation, because I'm like, dropping tons of wood on the ground and stuff. And I'll be doing that until they tell me to stop.
Okay, next one. What is the most persuasive approach you have used to convince private owners to manage their forests? And how about state forest owners?
I think there's a few different things. I think that there's a gajillion good reasons to do good forest management. And the things that I talk about to different landowners just depends on who they are and what's important to them. I think it's so important that we think, in a clear way about where stuff comes from in our world. And I think like the county that I come from, Chittenden County, is Vermont's, sort of most urbanized county. It's still mostly rural, but it has Vermont's biggest city in it. And, about a quarter of the people who live in Vermont live in this county, and it tends progressive politically. And, people who define themselves as politically progressive are often, they think that something that we've all decided is that forest management is not part of our world. But they also believe very strongly in equity, and they believe very strongly in using renewables, and they believe very strongly in, protecting endangered species and protecting biodiversity. And these are all things that, in a weird way, that forest management can actually support. And I think, sometimes one of the most compelling arguments is like, we're standing there on the, on the log landing surrounded by logs, like the cut up bodies of trees. And I'm like, this is, I'm clear headed. I understand that this is uncomfortable, but I would also challenge you to consider where all the things that you're wearing and all the things that you eat and all the things that you're using come from, and to recognize that all of those things have an environmental impact, which massively exceeds the environmental impact of cutting these trees and bringing them out of the woods. And so if this makes you uncomfortable, maybe you shouldn't be using all those other resources, because someone somewhere, some ecosystem somewhere, some species somewhere has to deal with that. And I think that's, so it's sort of like flipping this idea on its head, that it's not even that we want to do no harm, it's that we recognize that resource consumption is a big deal. If it feels like a big deal, it should. And we should feel the discomfort of the production of our own resources, and we should always endeavor to do better and to lower the negative impacts of that. But we consume stuff, and it has to come from somewhere. So I think that certainly sort of for one subset of the people that I deal with, that has been a very a hard to accept for people, but I think powerful message.
Next question. If a forest soil is wet and will be damaged by compression, how is a forest managed for succession, or is it left unmanaged?
So it could be either, in forest management, if there are areas we talk about, and as you go further south, these lines tend to blend together. But in Vermont, we have areas that we think of as winter ground and areas we think of as summer ground, areas that are a little bit wetter, a little bit more sensitive. You'll only use logging equipment on. This is assuming that you're actually going to try and cut those trees and bring them out of the woods with like a skidder or something, some kind of logging equipment. You'll only use logging equipment on it when the ground's frozen. And so that will prevent the soil compaction, prevent hopefully the tree root damage associated with that heavy equipment traveling on those wetter, more sensitive soils. And then there will probably just be some areas that you're like, traditionally you would just still try and get into those areas, but maybe there's some areas where it's a really neat wetland, or just not even a wetland, but like a seepage forest, just kind of a wet forest, and you just don't manage that area. And that's fine. It's like protecting sensitive areas and recognizing that we don't need to manage every square foot of our world is I think super positive. And so again, like on any given area, you can have areas that you manage that have soils that are less sensitive. You have areas that you don't manage that the soils are more sensitive. You could have areas that you don't manage where the soils are less sensitive. All of those things are compatible, and you should not feel, you should feel like if you're managing and not managing, that's not in conflict at all. Those are two things that are completely compatible.
And looks like the last question for tonight. We've heard the term town forest, but we're not sure of its definition. Can you discuss what it is and what purpose it serves?
Sure. Yeah. So as Mike mentioned at the very beginning, I do manage a number of community forests, town forests. They're called all kinds of different things in Vermont. They're called town forests and natural areas and conservation areas, municipal forests, community forests. But all it is basically is an area of forest that a municipality, a town, owns. And town forests are really cool because they're public land, but their ownership and their management is much more accessible, right? Because it's done at the town level rather than at the state level or at the federal level. There are systems that are in place on state and federal forests to try and make them more accessible, but in reality, you're never going to see the kind of impact on the management of those public lands that you will if you can just go to a meeting, at the town hall or whatever, and make a big deal about something and actually make a change. So in Vermont, most of these town forests are managed by like conservation commissions, volunteers who just volunteer one night a week, and they think about conservation in their communities. or town forest committees, which can be either a town committee or an ad hoc committee. And you know, they're just people. And so what we get is these forests which are as diverse as the communities that they represent. They're managed in all different kinds of ways, all different kinds of focuses. Some of them are managed very intensively and have a history of active forest management. Some of them aren't managed at all. Some of them are managed primarily as a recreational resource. And so I just think that, you know, any kind of public land, so any kind of public land, any kind of conserved land, so land that's permanently protected, but especially conserved public land that's permanently protected and that's held in the public trust. I just think that's such a powerful concept, because owning land is a privilege, but everybody should be able to enjoy being able to be in the woods and knowing that those woods exist, and all the different things that those provide, that forests provide, all of us. And so, you know, I just love the idea of not just conserve public land, but then also conserve public land, which is more like flexible and agile, and the decision-making process is really transparent. And if you are in that community and you want to have a say in how it's managed, you can do it. And so that is something that I've really, really enjoyed about working with these community forests. So statewide, you know, community forests have been in Vermont for about 100 years. Statewide, they're all different kinds of things, all different, you know, types of shapes and sizes, and providing different benefits.
We have one more quick one. Could you mention the best indigenous trees to plant in Connecticut?
Boy, that is not a good question for me, because I'm not from Connecticut, so I don't know. That would be a good question for if you come to the next event in this series, you're going to have someone from Connecticut Forests and Parks, right, Mike? Yes. Yeah, and they'll be able to answer that. I want to answer the next one too, if that's okay, Jackie.
Sure. Glastonbury has a program called Pollinator Pathways. How do forests promote pollinating insects? Also, what is the role of swamps and wetlands in forest management?
So one of my, I'm going to answer the pollinator question. So I write these articles, and a lot of these articles are like, you know, more and more, I'm just sort of a glutton for punishment with trying to just kind of like, you know, really just get into what the different ways that people, the different opportunities for having a more evolved understanding of forests and our relationship with them, and sort of challenging a lot of these mindsets and beliefs that don't serve us, that we have about forests and their management. So one of the things that I thought was, you know, and also to try and like convince people of how important forests are. So one of the things I did recently was write an article about pollinators, and everybody loves pollinators, right? We have these beautiful pollinator meadows and these beautiful flowers, and, you know, these open areas, and they're buzzing with bees and with butterflies and all this other stuff. We know how much we love all that. But this article was about the fact that almost all of those pollinators, they visit pollinator meadows, but they actually live in the woods. So Vermont has, you know, over 300 species of native bees, and almost all of them live in rotting wood, you know, another benefit of that dead wood, right? Rotting wood, or in decomposing leaf litter, like in the duff in the forest floor. So many of those butterflies, then their adult form, they'll be out and, you know, beautifully flitting around those pollinator meadows. They spend their whole larval stages on trees. And there's actually a really cool book specifically about oaks by Doug Tallamy. So Doug Tallamy, I think he's from Pennsylvania. He's like a pollinator guy. And he wrote this new book specifically about oaks, because oak trees, specifically for whatever reason, support this incredibly huge diversity of these different pollinators, especially again in their larval stages, caterpillars, which is really, really important food source for birds, especially as they're raising their young. So protecting you know, like we think about protecting these beautiful pollinator meadows, but if we want to protect pollinators, and usually like somewhere between 2/3 and 80% of our plants are pollinated by insects or animals. If we want to protect those benefits, the ability of all those plants to reproduce, we got to protect forest land. In addition to those big, beautiful pollinator meadows, which are really easy to appreciate, we also have to conserve forest land to actually provide a complete habitat for those organisms.
Okay. I think we're back to Michael.
Am I up?
You are.
Okay, thank you, Jackie.
Mike, I'm just gonna pop a link to my link tree here in the chat in case people want to check out some other stuff I'm working on.
Okay, great.
But thanks everybody.
Thank you. You did not disappoint. You covered a host of subjects, more than I ever would have been able to come up with on my own. I do want to plug Northern Woodlands Magazine. I've been a subscriber for over a dozen years. If you're interested in the outdoors and the environment and conservation, the magazine covers a wide swath. And Ethan's also a tremendous writer, not just a speaker. Loved your article in the autumn issue about crop tree release. And I'll tell you, I read it. I went to the bookshelf, picked up Sand County Almanac, and I went to November. And in November, there's an essay called Axe in Hand. And you can draw a direct line from Aldo Leopold and Axe in Hand to 75 years later, your article on Northern Woodlands. And I thought that was a really cool thing. So congratulations on that. As far as plugging some future events, we do have a hike coming up. You can visit our website at www.lhcglastonbury.org. We're going to be doing the Hollister White House property on November 28th. That's the Sunday following Thanksgiving. You can burn off a little bit of turkey. Short hike, a little bit on the steep side, some rocky terrain, but the payoff is a nice vista looking west out over the Connecticut River Valley in Hartford. That'll be led by Frank Caputa from Cogscout Land Trust. And we're going to start from the ground up, and the theme for that walk is geology. So we'll hit rock bottom and work up from there. Thanks again, Ethan. Look forward to your continued work. I'll definitely keep up to date. Check out on YouTube, and we'll see you in Northern Woodlands Magazine as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you.